So we will wait for a minute to make sure that everybody enters the room, and then we will start. Okay. So hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today, sponsored by the Access Forum. My name is Anastasia Papas, and I'm the founder of the forum. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Raphaël Poignet and Katharina Plavec, who will present their paper, An Examination of Net Zero Commitments by the World's Largest Banks. Today's webinar is a good segue to one of our September webinars when Maria Assunta Gianetti presented her paper, Glossy Green Banks, where she and her co-authors analyzed how consistent are the environmental disclosures of European banks with their lending practices. But let me introduce you to the speakers. Raphaël is a senior team lead at the ECB in the Directorate General, where he's in charge of the direct supervision of systemic and international banks. He serves as a counselor to the senior management as he is leading the supervisory work regarding climate-related and environmental risk disclosures. He joined the ECB in 2014, following an experience as an on-site inspector in a large banking group in France. He holds master degrees from ESSEC Business School and Seoul National University. Katharina is a graduate program participant at the ECB. She currently works in the ECB's legal services, where she's involved in the analysis of EU legislation and the assessment of banks' disclosures. She holds a PhD in law from the University of Vienna and a master in science in law and finance from the University of Oxford. But as always, let me invite you to respond to our short survey that we are going to launch right now. So the first question is, how many global systemically important banks have publicly communicated on net zero commitments? And the second question is, what is the main challenge for banks to align the portfolios with a net zero pathway? I'm going to take a few minutes, a few seconds, more like it. Okay, so it's interesting. The first question, the audience is divided. Something 10 banks have communicated on net zero commitments, and something that all of them have. The second question, the majority of the audience responded that all of the above. In other words, lack of data and methodology, lack of incentives, lack of, no, actually, and lack of regulation are the main challenges for banks to align their portfolios with a net zero pathway. Great. And on this note, the floor is yours, Raphaël.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Thanks for allowing us to present the conclusion of our paper. So we are about to share the presentation. If the technique works and it works, that's wonderful. So if you go to the next slide, Katharina, this is basically what we will be presenting today. I will first say a few words of introduction, setting the scene, maybe providing already some the answer to the two questions that were raised in the beginning. Then we'll go through the main findings of the paper and discuss also the potential consequences of greenwashing, which is obviously now becoming a quite important topic, at least very much discussed. And then after we will discuss also a potential way forward that we presented in the paper, mostly from a policy perspective. So now starting with the introduction. So why did we conduct this exercise? Is because at the ECB, of course, we tend to assess on a very regular basis the climate-related risk management practices of the banks we supervise, but also from a Pillar 3 perspective, all those climate disclosures, that are out there. And what we really realized is actually we're seeing more and more net zero commitments from banks. So actually not only the very large ones, but also the smaller ones. And we thought that considering that we have access basically to already a lot of information that is publicly available, it would be actually nice to deep dive a little bit and see what the GSIB, so the largest banks, systemic banks, are actually doing in that regards. We reviewed these very large banks' net zero commitments in detail, and with the idea to identify possible weaknesses and inconsistencies, trying to make a bit of reflection and discussion around this topic progress, as we believe that these weaknesses could cast otherwise could cast doubt on the soundness of these net zero claims and potentially result in accusation of greenwashing. We've seen that this is a topic, as I mentioned, that is spreading and that is attracting a lot of attention, obviously. Important to mention that the definition we consider in the paper for greenwashing is the one of the so-called European supervisory agencies, the ESAs, where greenwashing is defined as a practice where sustainability-related statements, declaration, actions, or communications do not clearly and fairly reflect the underlying sustainability profile of an entity, a financial product, or financial services. So the practice may be misleading to consumer investors or other market participants. So as I mentioned, we will conclude on the necessary policy developments we see. But before that, I suggest already to move to the first results of this examination and the first result also of the answer to the first question. So Katharina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. On this slide, you already see the answer to the first question, and that shows that actually 25 of the GSIBs, the world's largest banks, are currently members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Only 4 of the GSIBs have not made any net zero commitment. And then there is one case of a bank that is not an NCBA member at group level, but where the EU subsidiary is. Another preliminary finding we can already show on this slide is that we found that some sectors are more likely to be covered by net zero commitments than others. And perhaps not surprisingly, the power generation and the oil and gas sectors are covered by 2/3 of the banks. And this graph shows quite nicely that while there are these sectors are very often covered, this is much less the case for other sectors, for instance, real estate or shipping. Now, while many of the banks made net zero commitments, if you then deep dive into how these commitments are formulated, we found that the language used is often very vague or aspirational, and that often there is no concrete or overarching information that links these net zero goals to concrete scenarios, metrics, or portfolios that are disclosed. We also found that quite often banks use disclaimers pointing to factors beyond their own control, for instance, relating to net zero commitments of their clients, but also to regulatory developments. We then see some banks that make a net zero commitment, but then when looking at it, we see that this actually only relates to their own operations. So to their emissions stemming from their offices, for example, or in some cases, we find that the net zero commitment only relates to the green financing portfolios they have, so the amount they invest into green projects. And then in particular with French banks, we sometimes see commitments not to net zero, but to carbon neutrality, which is a bit problematic because this concept is even unclearer. So it is not entirely clear what is meant and what is covered by a commitment to carbon neutrality. And on this page, you see what these statements look like, copied from the publicly available disclosures of some of the banks.
Okay, now allow me to spend a few minutes on some of the findings, that we try to elaborate on in the paper. So this is just a sub-selection of findings. There are more, and again, the idea is not to overly criticize everything that the banks are doing. Obviously, in being supervisors by nature, we tend to focus on the things that can be improved. And obviously and factually, there are some of them. So starting maybe with the choice of the base year. So banks can choose the base year depending on data availability and quality, but this is not sufficiently disclose how the selection of different base years would change the required adjustments toward a net zero pathway. So basically what we're saying is, of course, it's normal. You need to start somewhere. You need to define, where is, so to say, in the curve, the starting points, and to achieve a certain decrease, usually expressed in percentages. But however, we've seen a bit of everything, we see like 2019, 2018, 2019, 2020 on sometimes one portfolio, sometimes a different portfolio. Sometimes, this change from 1 year to another. So, and all this usually lacked a bit of information. And we believe, that there can be a reason. For example, in the EU, you can consider, so regulation to help you determine a base year or certain data availability. But of course, narratives around that would be very, very helpful. Then it's the same with the choice of target years. Well, I mean, unsurprisingly, we have 2030, and that is actually the date that's been, say, used by many of the GSIPs that committed to net zero. However, some others used directly 2050, and actually only very few have interim targets, which can be a bit considered as problematic, especially when, this target years is pretty far away. The interim targets from a transition planning a bit perspective, if you like, would certainly help, see a bit in a more granular way the efforts of the banks and the alignment of the portfolio to its objectives. Now going to the choice of sectoral targets. So I think here this is something that we found maybe even more relevant is so Katharina showed the sectors, that the banks focus on, and they make obviously a lot of sense. Talking about oil and gas, power generation, commercial real estate, steel, cement, and so on and so on. However, at no point, and almost for none of the banks, there was actually a bit of explanation, on the relevance and the materiality for the exposures of the bank. So usually what a bank would normally do, from a risk management perspective, assess the materiality of the exposures in terms of balance sheets, so assets, so credit risk, but also maybe from a profitability perspective to see a bit, where there's actually a need to prioritize some of the sectors rather than others, rather than following a little bit, like a random order. So we've seen some banks where we know that that necessarily they don't have a lot of exposures in certain sector, but that specific sector was featured in priority. While actually, on the contrary, you know, when you look at all the net zero commitments made around real estate, which is de facto something very material for many of the banks, well, we see that usually this is not necessarily a sector, you know, that has attracted a lot of focus. I mean, for specific reasons, obviously. I mean, we fully understood that data are not necessarily available, but again, goes back to this prioritization and materiality assessment, which is highly relevant, we believe. Targets, choice of the sectoral target. I will just mention something else. Is actually, you know, everything that's that surrounds, you know, this choice of sectoral targets is related to this to the sectoral policies, you know, that are in place in the banks, that are again not necessarily fully consistent with the net zero ambition that is there. So either in terms of a number of exclusions, you know, from the policy, and potential impact, you know, on the coverage of the sectors, could be one example, or you know, the specific exclusion of activities, you know, that actually are absolutely not relevant for the business model of the bank. I mean, Arctic search for, I mean, oil. Arctic search is something that we have seen quite often. While actually, for some of the banks, we know for sure that they don't have such exposure. So I mean, this is nice, but this is not necessarily what is most interesting in these public documents. And then the target coverage. So here maybe is a bit polemical, but so sometimes we have doubt, we know whether the targets encompass all the relevant emissions of interest. So here, of course, this is obviously challenging. You know, usually they are covering finance emissions. Finance emissions express also in terms of greenhouse gas intensity per physical output. This is very good, but considering the business model of those very large banks, GSIBs, and their facilitating role, you know, in terms of securitization, I mean, issuance of securities, you know, that can be in relation with the sectors actually that they are targeting. We believe, you know, that more information could be provided in the form, for instance, of facilitated emissions, even though, of course, the methodology is nascent, but this is something that we consider could be they could explore further. So we just provide one illustration, but there are many others in the reports about one bank reporting inclusion of key sectors exposed to transition risk in its 2030 financing activity targets. But when we had actually a closer look, we could see that were excluded most actually of the targets related to intensive subsectors like oil and gas storage, equipment and drilling, and so on and so on. So now we can go to the next slides and explore the potential consequences on greenwashing.
Yes, moving on, as Raphaël has already mentioned, we build and rely in our paper on the common understanding of greenwashing that was developed by the European supervisory authorities. And we rely on this definition in particular because it also really reflects the entity here. So it does say that sustainability related statements may refer to the underlying sustainability profile of an entity, whereas many of the other definitions that have been developed focused more on the product level. But as the net zero commitments, of course, refer to the entity, this is the definition we are using, being, however, well aware that there is no joint and clear definition on greenwashing, especially not on an international level. Now, what are the potential legal consequences of greenwashing and of the shortcomings we have identified? On the one hand, we see actions taken by authorities. So this can be based on a specific legal basis, for instance, actions that are taken by the SEC. However, many of the actions relating to greenwashing are also taken by more traditional authorities, for instance, in the space of misleading advertisement. Then, of course, we have the big group of actions brought by association and NGOs. Again, these legal actions might be based on misleading advertisement, but also on consumer protection or unfair trading laws. What we see increasingly is also a trend to file claims based on inaccurate disclosures. So one example is a case that has recently been filed by an NGO against a French bank. So that case is primarily about inaccurate disclosures, but has repercussions and attaches upon greenwashing specifically as well. Now, going forward, we also assessed and estimate that derivative actions may be brought. So these are actions that are taken by shareholders of a bank on behalf of the bank against the bank's directors. Now, we are not aware of any cases of derivative actions with regards to greenwashing that have already been filed against banks, but we are aware that such actions have been tried against other companies, including oil and gas companies, and against the actions taken or the non-sufficient actions, in fact, taken by directors. So we think it is quite likely that this might be an avenue that could be further pursued by individuals in cooperation with NGOs going forward, also against banks. Now, what we then also assess in our paper is the type of weaknesses and what could be the potential supervisory reaction to it. Now, we identify a number of weaknesses that might be the reason for inaccurate disclosures, starting with a lack of oversight from the management body. And this could, the supervisory reaction in this regard could be to reassess the collective suitability by the management board, which might also be relevant for future fit and proper assessments. Now, also in connection with that, the inaccurate disclosures might be due to the fact that no manager is clearly accountable to climate-related disclosures. And again, this could be addressed by changing internal arrangements of the bank. Now, there is, of course, often a close connection to failures of the risk management function. So the inaccurate disclosures may originate from the fact that the risk management function does not properly monitor and report climate-related information. And this could be remedied by improving the risk management framework within the bank. Similar challenges might arise if the audit function is not able to detect inaccurate or misleading information, which might also be due to lack of authority, lack of knowledge or capabilities within the audit function. Here, the supervisory response would be to require the bank to strengthen the audit function, in particular by making sure that there is more knowledgeable staff or perhaps amending the reporting line. Then these disclosures might also have an impact or a close connection to compliance risk, because banks might sometimes not fully understand the extent of legal implications of inaccurate disclosures and the associated greenwashing risks. And here, the supervisory intervention should focus on requiring the bank to, again, improve the knowledge of the compliance function with a particular focus on climate-related risk. And finally, there is, of course, the issue of ineffective information and communication systems. In particular, inaccurate data aggregation processes and tools might result in the bank not being able to correctly and coherently aggregate climate-related data. And in this regard, the supervisory follow-up normally relays on both short-term workarounds as well as more long-term remediation plans to assess this issue. And however, when the probability of severely misstating risks is particularly high, temporary capital measures would also be possible. And with that, we go on with the possible way forward.
Okay, thanks, Katharina. So now, if you go to the next slides, we fully acknowledge that the market initiatives, such as GFANS and ZB are the most famous ones. They do establish very clear framework for the banks to commit to net zero, and basically they have really fostered a very like positive move, you know, in the financial sector. With that basically led to the surge in terms of a private commitment. So this is obviously very positive, and we are also convinced that, as we write in the paper, that all these private initiatives will continue to play a key role in the transition. So what we've been doing and what we try to explain today is to identify, you know, the areas in particular where this private initiative may be strengthened, with maybe some additional guidance, or what we also suggest is further regulation that could support the harmonization of disclosure. So the question is always like, when a disclosure is purely voluntarily based, to what level, you know, this harmonization and comparability can be achieved. In our experience, in the EU experience, we believe, at least this is our personal views, that further regulation could help, you know, limit all these weaknesses related to the net zero commitments that we identified. So we explored two different tools for that. The first one is disclosures, and the second one are transition plans. So the form of transition planning, if you like. If you go to the next slides. So this is the way we could see the weaknesses to be addressed by disclosure requirements. So no worry, I will not go through every single detail of everything we are suggesting. I mean, this is just for information, and this is to fuel a bit the ongoing debate. And I think this is a quite rather vivid one in terms of climate disclosures, and not only in Europe, but also internationally. But the idea was, of course, to foster the selection of portfolios. You know, as we mentioned, you know, that there needs to be based, you know, on materiality assessments. So you know, this goes a bit in the sense and the meaning and the idea, you know, beyond all the climate disclosures that are based on materiality. And sorry, this is something where we could see value for disclosures, maybe to provide a bit additional guidance on. Same thing with the outdated milestones and targets. So the idea would be, where relevant, to include time series of disclosed metrics to enable comparison, and also to have base years of metrics to be always disclosed and consistent. So that is something, you know, that can be added to the regulation. As a matter of comparison, in the EU, we have a so-called EBITS on Pillar 3 on ESG risk. It's a lot of acronyms, but basically it's a very comprehensive piece of regulation where we have specific templates for the banks to disclose their Pillar 3. In one of those templates, called the template 3, banks will have to disclose their alignment metrics. So here, you know, you have really a point-in-time comparison, which is 2030, and you have also a very clear scenario to use as a benchmark. This is actually the one of the International Energy Agency. So the third aspect that we believe could be integrated also in a broader disclosure regulation, in the integration in portfolio steering. So what we of course fully acknowledge, and this is very positive, is all these very carbon intensive sectors that have been covered by the GSIPs in their net zero commitments. Obviously, it should be shown, you know, how this is also used to steer the portfolios. This is something that we would expect to see. Same thing, by the way, also with all these green financing targets. I mean, this is not in the presentation; it's in the paper, but we have observed actually a large variety, you know, of terminology for green financing. Fully aware, of course, that not everyone has the EU taxonomy, which is pretty restrictive and very sort of subject to many rules. But however, you know, we would for sure, when a bank makes like a commitment in terms of green financing, at least to make as explicit as possible, you know, this what they understand by green financing, and how they use this KPI, you know, to steer really their portfolio. The use of scenarios that are not credible. I mean, I will not spend too much time, but obviously, you know, referencing net zero scenarios that are scientifically grounded would definitely help. Also, provide credibility to these commitments. And last is a lack of accountability that can be further explored and improved. Now, if you go to the next slides, so we have basically made a bit something similar to transition plans. So here, maybe rather than transition plans, actually, I should have written transition planning, because while disclosures, would focus very much on, the external information sharing. Transition plans can be integrated in the disclosures, but transition planning would be understood here among all the internal, so say internal management and risk processes, supporting the management of the transition risk and the management of the transition in general in the banks. And here you would find things that are a bit similar in terms of inaccurate portfolio selection. So this is where the materiality assessment comes into play. This is very important. Same thing with the targets. This reflects and mirrors what I was saying also for disclosures. And third aspect, even more important here, because this is internal, is how all these commitments really is integrated in the portfolio steering. Where is the link between the commitments, the metrics that are being used, the monitoring of these metrics, and the actions of the management of the boards in terms of trying, to adjust their financing where possible. Obviously, that goes together with a proper internal governance around these transition planning processes. But I think this is well on the way, in at least in some jurisdictions. And the last point is to avoid, of course, the low quality proxies. We are fully aware, that data can be missing, even though the situation is really improving fast. And with SSB and CSRD, it will be even better. However, and it's tolerated that banks use proxies also from our supervisory perspective when we talk about climates. However, there are proxies and proxies. So obviously, some proxies are much better and much more granular than others. So we would, of course, encourage all kind of regulation around transition planning to take into account this broad variety of proxies to at least to push the banks, to work on high quality proxies to the extent possible. And now if we go to the next slide, I think we are at the end of our presentation. So happy to, yes, okay, 30 minutes, so should have time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphaël and Katharina, for a very interesting conversation. I would like to remind the audience that you could use the Q&A function to post your questions. Okay, so until we get some questions from the audience, I have a couple of questions. And one is, as we sort of touched upon before the webinar, how can banks clearly articulate a transition plan when their clients don't have one? Shouldn't there be any convergence in this type of requirement?
So thanks for the very good question. So I can start, and Katharina, don't hesitate also to complement. Obviously, this is a very good point. A bank, willing to go into like a very detailed and strong transition plan should, of course, assess the transition plans on its own client, also to determine whether there is potential, for transition within the client. So we are fully aware, of course, that so far transition plans are not necessarily available everywhere and insufficient granular information. We would note, however, that this is evolving pretty fast. Of course, I was mentioning CSRD in Europe, SSB internationally. So we see also more, and the development, of a lot of guidance, also regarding TCFD, on what a good transition plan looks like outside the financial sector. So we believe this is becoming increasingly available. What we have observed as well is some of the banks also have been asking directly their clients, to produce one, or at least to produce some metrics, that can be useful for them to be convinced, so to say, that they can be refinanced. So I would maybe before giving the floor to Katharina, maybe give a positive note. Of course, this is something that can be improved. When I started working on climate disclosures back in 2019 and assessing, what was done in the EU banks, the situation was very poor. There was almost nothing really. Even in the largest banks, it was very very patchy and very sparse. 4 years later, and the distribution is completely different. And even in the smaller banks, we do have a lot of information. So I believe, there's a trend, there's a momentum, also outside the financial sector to get there. Takes a bit of time, but I believe this will be the case.
I think the issue of transition plan is interesting to our audience. There's another question that goes, do you have any insights about the need for prudentially oriented transition plans from your research?
So here I'm a bit careful with what I'm going to say because this is actually on the way. Obviously, we are supervisors at the European Central Bank, so we do supervise, the banks that are subject to the so-called CRD requirements, and in the CRD that is coming into force in 2025, there are specific requirements for prudential transition plans that should, of course, have a strong risk component because this is a prudential definitions and our approach to supervision. So the answer is yes, we do see a lot of value. This is also what we try to foster and to encourage in the paper, and we also do believe that there is room to integrate in those transition plans all the net zero commitments that the banks can make to make them, so to say, coherent with their transition plans.
Thank you, Raphaël. One more question on transition planning. It looks like you are talking about individual transition planning by banks, which may be mostly grounded on individual risk management. This may not be compatible with macro transition planning, which needs, for example, to keep financing some key carbon sectors still. How do you cope with that?
So yes and no. I mean, I dare to disagree a little bit. Of course, so this macro aspect is fully relevant. We're not saying that the financial system by itself will save the transition and will unilaterally convert the whole economy to become a net zero. That's not what we're saying. And banks need to be fully they need to acknowledge also the limitations, and the progress made by the industry. That being said, I think the micro transition plans are very much relevant because there are many different practices in the different industries. You have transition industries and actors in those industries that transition better than others that are investing. This is things that we have observed in terms of capex, for instance, and on that basis, it is possible, so to say, to rank, so to say, the clients, not in a perfect way. I mean, this is already this is only the start of a long journey, but it is already possible, to assess and try to evaluate how a certain client is positioning itself, for the future years. But by the way, this forward-looking approach is not only for climate. I believe, from risk management perspective, that's what banks do very well, on many other risk metrics not affecting the bank. They observe, the market and how the specific actor position itself in the market.
So one other question that you touched a little bit upon, and it goes, do you think more reliable disclosure will open the door to judicial action?
I can take this one. So what we have seen indeed is that there is this general wave of climate-related litigation, which one part of it is, of course, now litigation based on disclosures. However, there are also all kinds of different avenues that are used to target banks. So even if a bank is not disclosing anything, there might be climate-related litigation being brought against the bank for not being Paris aligned, for not doing enough, for potentially also infringing human rights. So while indeed there might be increased litigation that comes with increased disclosure. There might also be climate litigation coming for not disclosing or for not doing anything. So this is just, I think, a general trend we are seeing of NGOs targeting corporates, but also increasingly banks for climate related actions. So this is not necessarily limited to disclosure.
Question. What could be the most efficient incentives for banks to properly implement the alignment to net zero commitment? What do you think about green monetary policies like GDCR or GDRR?
Okay, that's not an easy question. I will certainly not answer the second part of the question because of the separation principle, in terms of supervision and central banking. So I cannot express myself. I mean, Katharina, feel free to do so, but it's a bit outside the remit of our paper. On the first aspect, you can see it from a risk perspective. I'm referring here to the numerous speeches of the vice chair of the European Central Bank, Frank Elderson, who's usually mentioning, that um, failing to transition is planning to fail. So you could see, all these efforts, to develop transition plans to try to become net zero also as a very positive business exercise as well. To try to determine, how do you want to position yourself in the short, medium, and long term. It has a lot of advantages. I mean, obviously, there are limitations in terms of voluntary commitments. If regulation, as we try to explain, is helping framing a little bit, this the way the banks develop their transition plans, maybe their commitments, or at least disclose their metrics, their KPIs in relation to those activities. It might actually, create a bit of a momentum and, further efforts of the banks to collect relevant data, to analyze their clients and create a positive loop, in terms of transitioning. I don't know, maybe Katharina, you have also anything additional to add?
No, nothing from my side. I think this was well summarized.
Picking up on your point of the banks should not be passively waiting for their counterparties to decarbonize. What do you think they can target and report on in terms of determining and tracking the success of an active strategy?
Okay, I can take that one. This is a very good question. As I mentioned during the presentation, we have not really observed, how the banks, as I mentioned, use these metrics to steer a portfolio. I mean, when you have a KRI, usually, or a KPI, the idea is to monitor that KPIs and to take actions, to divert and to try to influence the KPI. It can be done in different ways. One easily understood one is, of course, everything sector specific, so sector specific policies. This is where we would see actually a lot of potential to try to steer the portfolios of banks. Actually, the portfolios that are covered by the metrics, like alignment metrics that we have identified, and that will support the banks in their efforts to become net zero. But that's also true for green financing. So the conclusion is, how do you have like a good governance, meaning that how do you monitor, these metrics? How do you monitor, everything that is being done by the clients, which is not necessarily easy once you have granted, the loan, and then you need to follow up. This is how you do this. And then from a risk management, after like how you determine, maybe a sets of limits, exclusion policies, if after considering, which kind of clients in the future you want to have with you in your portfolio or not have in your portfolio. So this is depending a little bit, of course, on the appetite, on the risk appetite of banks, but this is an exercise that needs to be done. The thing what we're saying is, of course, it's very good to be to express itself as net zero. We understand, of course, that once it's done, there's a lot of work going on. However, it needs to be coherent, you know, it cannot be just stated like this, report a few metrics, but just if you wait passively, nothing happens. It needs to be shown they are potential, you know, to, especially for that's why we also selected the very large banks, because, you know, they are influential. I mean, they have a say, so to say, you know, in the way, you know, that some of the financing schemes are structured. So this is basically, you know, where, you know, the internal policies of banks could really play an important role.
Question: how would you proceed to measure materiality of climate risks? It's an additional challenge to find those material risks and then integrate them into a transition plan.
Okay, another very good question. I would like to refer to our ECB guides on the management and disclosures of climate risk. We have a very nice expectation that we remind very often to the banks we supervise as regards the definition of materiality and the use of and the need to use the right, so to say, quantitative and qualitative information to understand, you know, where are the risk drivers, in particular for transition risk, which is highly relevant in the context of net zero commitments. And on the basis of, you know, this quantitative, qualitative information on different time horizons, a bank would be obviously in a position, so to say, to determine which portfolios are more relevant than others. Said more simply, I can also have a look. I mean, if you look at the size of the portfolio, compare it, you know, to the overall size of your exposures, I mean, that already gives you an indication, you know, where you might have actually a potential impact from a credit risk perspective. If on top, of course, you try to calculate a good metric, could be finance emissions, you know, where are the pockets, you know, the carbon pockets, you know, within your portfolio. That's also another metrics. I mean, there are different approaches to do that, but I think that some of the sectors, usually the banks, you know the sectors that are more relevant than others, you know, for these metrics.
One more question, Raphaël, that's an interesting one. On a score from 1 to 10, 10 being perfect, what are your expectations in terms of the quality of the first upcoming taxonomy disclosure by banks in 2024?
Katharina?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm in a position to give an exact score. That might be a bit tricky. But as Raphaël mentioned previously, I think what we've really seen in the last years is that the disclosures have in general improved year upon year. So, I mean, Raphaël, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we have seen banks getting worse. So each individual bank has gotten better. The disclosures have become more granular, have used more data, have become more comprehensive as well. So considering this, my personal opinion would be that yeah, the quality should be at least reasonable.
So yes, if it's on taxonomy specific disclosures, so referring to the green asset ratio, it's hard to tell because I think I've seen only one bank disclosing it so far. So I cannot anticipate what they will be disclosing. Now the question can be understood in two ways. What do I expect in terms of quantitative results of this? And here, of course, I don't expect, you know, the green asset ratios from the banks to be very high. I mean, this is by construction, by design, it cannot be the case. I think the EBA had made an assessment of a green asset ratio, an average green asset ratio, probably around 7%, could be even lower, depending on the bank. So let's see how it is. And in terms of data quality, well, let's meet maybe in 1 year time, and we tell you what we have observed. Always happy to do that.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? I'll get the chance to ask my last question. In the webinar I mentioned at the very beginning, Giannetti presented her findings, and she basically argued that some European banks are willing to lend to zombie brown banks. No, zombie brown companies, that do not have any alternatives for financing because they don't want to realize the loss in their balance sheet. She basically argued that this type of actions sort of is a feature of this relationship banking, which is important for their banking model. So she was actually basically transferring the onus to the industry, the companies, to come up, with transition plans, to evaluate disclose their emissions, to evaluate the risks, so that the banks then can do or follow closer their commitments to net zero.
So it's another challenging question, but good question. So I can repeat, what we've been publicly saying also at the ECB. So I'm comfortable to do so because this is so to say public statements, including from our vice chair Frank Elderson, is that the ECB obviously is not telling any bank who they should finance and who they should not finance. So that's something that we that is not to be comprehended in the concept of transition plans and in terms of how we interact nowadays with the banks. So the banks are free to finance whoever they like if you wish. So what we're saying is what we have observed. The banks made these net zero commitments. We didn't ask them to do so. So however, it still means that they need to be coherent in their approach. So maybe you can achieve this net zero over a few years if you set interim targets, if you finance some clients that have a bit more challenges than others to decarbonize. I cannot take all of course individual cases separately, and that might be, as say, some examples like the one you mentioned. I don't know, but it needs to be so to say, in line with the overall strategy of the bank. If you make exception after exception after exception, this of course leaving a bit of losing a bit of credibility. So we're not saying that the banks should, of course, give up on this net zero commitment because of this challenge. It's just a sense of coherence, and further assessment of this client's capabilities. It's a risk management in the end. It's a risk management question for the banks. If one of your exposure and one of your clients, cannot undergo a transition in a jurisdiction, where the rules are pretty strict. How does the credit profile of that company looks like? And compare it, with a similar question, non-climate related, and how would you behave as a bank? What would be the consequences once the credit matures? So, it's not for me to answer, but I think it's more like a risk management issue.
I don't see any other questions from the audience. So many thanks for a very interesting presentation. A lot of food for thought for all of us going forward, but it's great to hear you say that there's a lot of progress that is being made. So I think, it would be good to stop this webinar on this happy note, I would say. For the audience, I would like to thank you for joining us. This is a subject that has caught the attention also of our Young Scholar webinar series. So we have 2 webinars coming up on March 25th and on April 8th that will present research on the same subject. So if you're interested, you can always visit our website and register for these webinars too. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.